Welcome to our deep dive,
Yeah.
into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck.
Okay.
The book that, kind of flips the whole self-help thing on its head.
Right.
Well, we've waded through it for you, and we're excited to share what we found because,
Yeah.
let's face it, who has time to read every book that comes along?
Well, that's true.
So,
What's interesting about this book is that it's not about, plastering on a fake smile and pretending everything's sunshine and roses.
hmm
It's about getting real with yourself about what you truly value.
right.
And believe it or not, embracing the struggles that come with those values.
Okay, so it's less about being happy-go-lucky and more about being strategic about what you care about.
Exactly. And Manson illustrates this with the story of Charles Bukowski, this writer who was honestly kind of a mess,
Yeah.
but he was brutally honest about it,
Yeah.
and that resonated with people.
So it's like owning your flaws can actually be a strength.
That's Manson's argument.
Interesting.
Bukowski wasn't trying to be someone he wasn't. He embraced his imperfections, and it became his trademark.
Yeah.
The problem is we're constantly bombarded with these messages telling us we need to be perfect, happy, and successful all the time.
Oh, yeah, and that's where we get caught in this feedback loop from hell.
Right.
Right, you see all these curated lives on social media,
Yeah.
and you start thinking, why isn't my life like that?
Right. And then because you're not experiencing that constant bliss,
Yeah.
you feel even worse.
Mm.
It's this vicious cycle that feeds on itself.
Yeah, so how do we break free? Because it's easy to say, don't compare yourself to others, but actually doing it is a whole other ballgame.
Manson suggests a counterintuitive approach.
Okay,
Accepting that negative emotions are a part of life,
okay.
not wallowing in them, but acknowledging that they're there.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you try to force yourself to be happy all the time, you're actually setting yourself up for more unhappiness.
It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater.
Hmm.
The more you push it down, the more forcefully it pops back up. Yeah. So what's the alternative? Do we just let negativity rule our lives?
Not at all. It's about recognizing that struggling is a natural part of life.
Okay.
And here's the kicker. Manson says we should actually choose our struggles.
Okay, now that sounds kind of crazy. Why would we choose to struggle?
Right.
Isn't the whole point of life to avoid pain and seek pleasure?
Well, Manson argues that pain and struggle are essential for growth and meaning.
Okay.
He uses this analogy of a prince who had everything, but still felt empty.
Okay.
The prince sought enlightenment by running away and living in poverty, thinking it would bring him fulfillment.
And what happened? Did he find his inner peace amidst the dirt and deprivation?
Not exactly. It turns out that simply avoiding pain doesn't lead to happiness.
Right.
The key, according to Manson, is finding meaning in the struggles we choose.
Okay, so how do we go about choosing the right struggles?
Right.
Because let's face it, there's no shortage of problems in life.
That's true.
How do we know which ones are worth our time and energy?
This is where Manson introduces this concept of disappointment panda.
Disappointment panda.
Imagine a superhero, but instead of fighting crime, he delivers uncomfortable truths.
Okay.
He's there to remind you that life isn't always going to be easy, that disappointment is inevitable.
So it's like having a reality check mascot.
Yes.
Not exactly the most marketable superhero, but I get the point.
Exactly. Disappointment Panda is there to burst your bubble of unrealistic expectations.
Yeah.
And it ties into this idea that facing challenges head on, even when they're unpleasant,
Right.
can actually be beneficial.
So it's not that we should seek out pain for the sake of pain,
Right.
but that we should be willing to embrace the challenges that come with pursuing what we truly value.
Yes.
It's about choosing the discomfort that aligns with our goals and aspirations.
And to do that effectively, we need to get clear about what those values are.
Okay.
Because if we're not clear about what's important to us,
Right.
we're more likely to waste our energy on things that ultimately don't matter.
So it all boils down to defining our values and setting the right metrics for success and failure. Right.
That's it.
Otherwise, we're just chasing someone else's definition of a meaningful life.
Manson uses the story of Hiru Onoda, a Japanese soldier who stayed hidden in the jungle for 30 years after World War II was over, to illustrate this point.
30 years.
He was given an order to never surrender.
Wow.
And he clung to that value even when it was tragically outdated.
Wow, that's a powerful example of how our values, even when misguided, can shape our entire lives.
Yes.
He dedicated years to a cause that had ceased to exist.
Right.
It makes you wonder how often we get stuck in similar patterns, clinging to beliefs or goals that no longer serve us.
It happens all the time, and the problem is when we're not aware of our values,
Yeah.
we're more likely to adopt the values of others, which can lead to a sense of unfulfillment.
It's like we're living someone else's life instead of our own.
Precisely, and this can lead to all sorts of problems like the one Manson describes with the musician Dave Mustaine. He was kicked out of Metallica right before they hit it big.
Oh,
Even though he achieved success with his own band, Megadeth,
yeah.
he still felt like a failure.
Real.
Because he was constantly comparing himself to Metallica.
And talk about a painful situation.
Hmm.
He achieved success on his own terms, but still felt inadequate.
Yeah.
It's like he was using the wrong yardstick to measure his worth.
Exactly. Mustaine's experience highlights the importance of choosing the right metrics for success.
Mm-hmm.
He was so focused on external validation that he overlooked his own accomplishments.
It's a reminder that we need to define our own versions of success, independent of what others are doing.
Yes.
Otherwise, we'll always be chasing someone else's dream.
And that chase can be exhausting and ultimately unfulfilling, but it's not just about picking the right values, is it? It's also about taking responsibility for those values and their consequences, even when they lead to negative experiences.
So it's not enough to just say, these are my values. Yeah. We also need to own the outcomes, even when they're not what we hoped for.
Absolutely. Manson uses the analogy of a short man who struggles in dating because he places too much importance on height.
Okay.
He feels entitled to women's attention, even though he hasn't put effort into developing his personality or social skills.
Okay.
It's a tough example.
Yeah.
But it underscores the importance of examining our own choices and how they contribute to our problems.
Yeah.
It's about taking ownership rather than playing the victim card.
He's basically saying that we need to be honest with ourselves about how our choices are impacting our lives.
Yes.
And be willing to make changes if we're not getting the results we want.
Right. It's about recognizing that we have more agency than we often realize. And it's not about blaming ourselves for everything that goes wrong, but rather understanding how our values and choices are shaping our experiences.
So it's like, if I value honesty above all else, I need to be prepared to accept the consequences of being brutally honest.
Yes.
Even if it hurts someone's feelings or creates conflict. It's about owning the full spectrum of our values, not just the pleasant parts.
Precisely. And it's not always easy, in fact. It can be downright uncomfortable. But Manson argues that this discomfort is a necessary part of growth.
This reminds me of that personal anecdote Manson shares about getting cheated on.
Yes.
Initially, he blamed his ex for his misery. But he eventually realized that while she was responsible for her actions, she wasn't responsible for his feelings.
That's a powerful distinction, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we have a choice in how we respond to situations, even painful ones.
So even when something terrible happens, we still have the power to choose how we react to it.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our emotions are not always dictated by external events. We have more control than we think.
Which brings us back to this idea of not giving a fuck.
Yes.
It's not about being indifferent or apathetic.
Right.
It's about choosing where we direct our energy and attention.
Right. It's about deciding what's truly important to us and letting go of the things that aren't.
And that's not always easy.
Yeah.
There's this pressure to care about everything, to be outraged by every injustice, to strive for perfection in every area of our lives.
Right.
But Manson suggests that this kind of giving a fuck overload can actually be paralyzing.
It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. You end up overwhelmed and exhausted without actually accomplishing anything meaningful.
So it's about being selective, about prioritizing the things that truly align with our values and letting go of the rest.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we can't care about everything equally, and that's okay.
And this leads us to another important aspect of not giving a fuck.
Okay.
Taking responsibility for our own happiness.
Okay, now that sounds like a tall order. Aren't there external factors that influence our happiness?
Of course, but Manson argues that while we can't always control what happens to us, we can control how we respond to it.
He uses another powerful anecdote to illustrate this point, the one about the father whose child died in a car accident.
That's a heavy one, for sure. Even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, the father recognized that he still had a choice. To let the pain consume him, or to find a way to channel it into something meaningful.
So even in the darkest of times, we still have agency. We still have the power to choose how we move forward.
Precisely, and this is where Manson introduces the concept of practical enlightenment.
Okay.
It's not about denying the pain or pretending that everything is okay.
All right.
It's about acknowledging the suffering while still choosing to focus on what we can control.
So it's like acknowledging the storm while still steering the ship, right?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that life is full of challenges and setbacks, but that we have the power to choose how we navigate those challenges.
Right.
It's about cultivating a sense of resilience and inner strength, even in the face of adversity.
This is starting to sound less like a self-help book and more like a philosophy for living.
It is.
It's about taking ownership of our lives, even the messy parts, and choosing to focus on what truly matters. It's about finding meaning and purpose even when things are tough.
And that brings us to another key element in Manson's philosophy,
Okay.
uncertainty.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Most self-help books are all about creating certainty, about finding the one true path to happiness and success.
Right.
How does uncertainty fit into this not giving a fuck framework?
Well, Manson argues that embracing uncertainty is actually essential for growth.
Yeah?
He even described this fascinating experiment called the button experiment,
Right.
where people were put in a room and told to figure out how to make a light flash by pressing buttons.
Sounds simple enough.
What's so fascinating about that?
The catch is that the light flashes randomly.
Okay.
There's no pattern, no secret code to crack, but the participants, desperate to find meaning, convinced themselves they had figured it out.
Oh, wow.
They created elaborate theories to explain their success, even though it was all just random chance.
Wow. So even when faced with pure randomness, we still try to impose order and meaning. It seems to be a fundamental human need. We crave certainty even when it doesn't exist.
And what's the takeaway from this experiment? Why is it so important to recognize our tendency to create meaning out of randomness?
Because this tendency can lead us astray in all areas of life.
Yep.
We cling to beliefs and explanations even when they're not supported by evidence simply because they make us feel more secure.
So it's like we're building castles in the sand, creating these elaborate structures that can be washed away by the tide of reality.
Exactly. And this isn't just about silly experiments.
Yeah.
It applies to our relationships, our careers, our beliefs about the world.
Mhm.
We often cling to narratives that make us feel good even when they're not entirely accurate or helpful.
It's like that saying, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are.
Exactly. And Manson suggests that this tendency to create meaning out of randomness can be especially problematic in today's world, where we're constantly bombarded with information and opinions.
It's like we're drowning in a sea of information, desperately trying to cling to any life raft of certainty we can find.
And that desperation can make us vulnerable to manipulation, especially when it comes to things like outrage porn and victimhood chic.
Okay, those sound like pretty heavy concepts. Can you break those down a bit?
Outrage porn refers to this tendency to focus on sensationalized stories that trigger our emotions,
Okay.
often at the expense of nuance and truth.
It's like that saying, if it bleeds, it leads.
Exactly. And victimhood chic is this idea that being a victim has become a source of social currency.
Okay.
People are quick to claim victim status even when they're not actually being oppressed.
It's like there's this competition to see who suffered the most.
And both of these phenomena feed into our need for certainty.
Yeah.
We crave simple explanations, easy villains, and clear-cut narratives.
But life is rarely that simple, is it?
Not at all. And that's why Manson encourages us to embrace uncertainty,
Okay.
to be willing to question our assumptions and challenge our beliefs.
He's saying we need to be more comfortable with ambiguity, with the idea that we don't always have the answers.
Exactly. And this can be a challenging process, especially when our beliefs are deeply ingrained.
Right.
But it's a necessary step if we want to grow and evolve.
So how do we start to cultivate this comfort with uncertainty? Sounds pretty daunting.
Manson offers a few suggestions.
Okay.
One is to simply become more aware of our own biases.
Mm-hmm.
We all have them, and they influence how we see the world.
So it's like putting on a pair of critical thinking glasses, right?
Yes.
Trying to see things from multiple perspectives.
Exactly. And another suggestion is to be willing to change our minds.
That can be tough,
Yeah.
especially when we've invested a lot of time and energy in a particular belief.
It can feel like admitting defeat, but Manson argues that it's actually a sign of strength and maturity.
It's like saying I'm open to learning and growing, even if it means challenging my own preconceived notions.
And this ties into Manson's law of avoidance.
Okay.
The more something threatens your identity, the more you will avoid it. It's a reminder that we often shy away from anything that challenges our worldview, even if facing that challenge could lead to positive change.
So to grow, we need to be willing to get a little uncomfortable,
Yeah.
to challenge those deeply held beliefs.
Exactly. It's about developing intellectual humility, that willingness to say, you know what, I might be wrong.
Okay, but what does that look like in practice?
Yeah.
How do we actually start breaking free from those ingrained patterns?
One powerful tool Manson suggests is the power of saying no,
Okay.
not just to others, but also to ourselves,
Right.
and the limiting beliefs that hold us back.
Okay, I can get behind that. Sometimes it feels like we're constantly saying yes to everything and everyone,
Mm-hmm.
even when it goes against our own needs and desires.
And that can lead to resentment and burnout. Manson argues that saying no is essential for setting healthy boundaries, both in our relationships and in our lives as a whole. It's about recognizing that we can't please everyone all the time, and that it's okay to prioritize our own needs and values.
He actually shares a personal story about his nomadic lifestyle.
Yes.
For years, he traveled the world constantly seeking new experiences.
Yeah.
It sounded amazing, but he eventually realized he was running away from commitment,
Right.
from facing those deeper fears and insecurities that were holding him back.
It's a classic example of how even seemingly positive pursuits can be driven by unhealthy motivations.
Yeah.
He was chasing breadth of experience at the expense of depth.
And this isn't just about romantic relationships, right? It applies to all areas of life.
Absolutely.
It could be a job we're clinging to out of fear,
Yeah.
a friendship that's become toxic, a belief system that no longer serves us.
Absolutely. Saying no creates space for something better to emerge. It's about recognizing that we have a finite amount of time and energy,
Yeah.
and we need to be selective about how we spend them.
But isn't saying no selfish, especially when it comes to relationships? Don't we have an obligation to support our loved ones and be there for them even when it's difficult?
That's where Manson gets really nuanced. He distinguishes between healthy love and unhealthy love.
Okay.
Unhealthy love is based on neediness, on trying to control the other person or fix their problems for them.
So healthy love is about respecting boundaries and recognizing that we can't be everything to everyone.
Exactly. It's about supporting each other's growth without sacrificing our own needs and values.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we actually put this into practice? How do we know when to say yes and when to say no?
It's a delicate balance, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
But Manson suggests that we start by getting clear about our own needs and priorities.
Okay.
What are the non-negotiables in our lives? What are the things that we absolutely cannot compromise on?
So it's about creating a personal set of guidelines, a sort of internal compass that helps us navigate these complex decisions.
Exactly, and this compass will evolve as we grow and change. What was important to us 5 years ago might not be as important to us today.
So it's about checking in with ourselves, regularly reassessing our priorities, and making sure we're living in alignment with our values. It's exact.
It's not about being rigid or inflexible. It's about being honest with ourselves about what we truly need and want.
And that honesty is the foundation for healthy relationships, both with ourselves and with others.
This is starting to feel less like a guide to not giving a fuck and more like a blueprint for living a more authentic and fulfilling life.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's about getting real with ourselves about what truly matters
Yeah,
and letting go of the rest.
and that can be a scary process, but it can also be incredibly liberating.
It is. It's about embracing the freedom that comes with choosing our own path, even when it's uncertain.
Okay, I'm ready to dive deeper into this. What else does Manson have in store for us on this journey of not giving a fuck?
Well, this is just the beginning.
Okay.
We've laid the groundwork for understanding Manson's core philosophy,
Okay.
but there's so much more to explore. We'll be diving into the practical applications of this philosophy, exploring topics like relationships, work, and even death.
Death in a self-help book, that's a bit of a curveball, but I trust you to guide us through it. Trust me, it's not as morbid as it sounds. Manson actually uses the concept of death as a way to highlight the importance of living a meaningful life.
Okay, I'm definitely curious to hear more about that. But for now, let's take a break and give our listeners a chance to digest all this information. Join us for part 2, where we'll continue our deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a fuck. See you soon.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a fuck. You know, when we left off, we were talking about the power of saying no. And that's a perfect lead-in to what we're going to unpack next.
Okay, I'm all ears. Where are we headed?
Well, Manson makes this provocative connection between saying no and the concept of death.
Whoa, hold on. Saying no is like death. That sounds a bit extreme.
It might sound strange at first, but stick with me here. He's not saying they're literally the same thing,
Okay.
but he's using death as a metaphor.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Explain this metaphor to me.
Think about it this way. Just like death sets a boundary on our physical existence,
Okay.
saying no defines the limits of our emotional and psychological space.
So by saying no, We're essentially drawing a line in the sand saying, this is where my responsibility ends and yours begins.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we have a finite amount of time and energy and we can't be everything to everyone.
That makes sense. If we try to please everyone and say yes to everything, we'll end up spreading ourselves too thin.
Right.
And ultimately neglecting our own needs and values.
Right. And that's where the connection to death comes in. Manson argues that by accepting our own mortality,
Okay.
we're better able to prioritize what truly matters in the present moment.
So it's like by acknowledging the fact that our time is limited, we're more likely to make choices that align with our values
Yes.
and bring us true fulfillment.
Exactly. It's about living intentionally rather than just going through the motions.
That's a powerful perspective. But it's easier said than done right.
It is.
How do we actually apply this to our everyday lives?
Manson suggests a simple but profound exercise. Ask yourself, what am I willing to struggle for?
Okay, that's a good question.
Yeah.
It forces you to get real about what's truly important to you.
Exactly. And the answer will be different for everyone.
Mhm.
For some people, it might be their family, their career, their creative pursuits.
Right.
For others, it might be their health, their spiritual growth, or contribution to society.
And once you've identified those things,
Yes.
those areas where you're willing to embrace the struggle, you can start to let go of the things that aren't worth your time and energy.
Right. It's about becoming more discerning about where you invest your fucks.
This whole choosing your struggles thing is starting to click for me now.
Yeah.
It's not about avoiding challenges altogether.
Right.
It's about being selective
Yeah.
about which challenges we take on
Yes.
and making sure they align with what we truly value.
Precisely. And this leads us to another crucial aspect of not giving a fuck.
Okay.
Taking action.
Oh, I love this part.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get stuck in analysis paralysis,
Mhm.
overthinking everything and never actually making any progress.
Manson is a big advocate of what he calls the do something principle.
Okay, tell me more about that.
It's about recognizing that motivation often follows action, not the other way around.
So instead of waiting for inspiration to strike,
Yes.
we just need to start doing something, anything, even if it's small.
Exactly. The act of taking action creates momentum, which in turn generates motivation. It's like getting the snowball rolling.
This reminds me of that saying, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.
Exactly. And by focusing on action rather than results,
Okay.
we also shift our perspective on failure.
We become less afraid of making mistakes because we recognize that every experience, even the ones we perceive as negative,
Right.
can teach us something valuable.
Right. Failure becomes just another data point, another opportunity for learning and growth.
It's like that quote, I haven't failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work.
Exactly.
So it's about embracing experimentation, being willing to try things, even if we don't know the outcome.
Precisely. And that ties into the idea of embracing uncertainty, of being willing to step outside of our comfort zones and take risks, even if it means facing rejection or failure.
Because it's often in those moments of discomfort and uncertainty that we discover our true potential
Right.
and find the strength to create a life that is truly aligned with our values.
Exactly. It's about trusting that even if things don't go according to plan, we'll find a way to adapt and learn from the experience.
So it's about being comfortable with the unknown, with the idea that life is a journey, not a destination.
Right. And this journey is full of twists and turns, ups and downs. There will be times when we feel lost, confused, and uncertain,
Yeah.
but it's in those moments that we have the opportunity to grow the most.
And to rely on those values we were talking about earlier to guide us through the tough times.
Exactly. Our values are like a compass that helps us navigate the complexities of life. They provide a sense of direction and purpose,
Right.
even when we feel lost.
Okay. This is all starting to make sense, but there's one thing I'm still struggling with.
What's that?
The idea of trust.
Trust? What about it?
Well, Manson talks a lot about the importance of building trust, both in our relationships and in ourselves. But I'm not sure I fully understand what that means in the context of this not giving a fuck philosophy.
That's a great question, and it's a crucial one because trust is really at the heart of everything Manson is talking about.
Okay, I'm listening. Break it down for me.
Well, think about it this way. Without trust, relationships are just a series of transactions.
Okay.
There's no real intimacy or vulnerability.
It's like going through the motions, putting on a show for each other, but never really letting our guard down.
Exactly. And Manson argues that trust is built through honesty, even when it's uncomfortable.
He even shares that personal anecdote about being brutally honest with his wife about her appearance,
Uh-huh.
even though it might hurt her feelings.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, wow, that's a bit harsh.
It's definitely a controversial example.
Yeah,
And it's important to note that honesty doesn't give you a free pass to be insensitive or disrespectful.
right.
But I think the point he's trying to make is that true intimacy requires a willingness to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
to let our guard down and show our true selves, even the parts we're not proud of.
So it's not about sugarcoating things or pretending to be someone who we're not.
Right.
It's about being authentic, even when it's scary.
Exactly. And that kind of authenticity creates a foundation for deep and meaningful connection.
And that connection requires trust, right?
Yeah.
Trust that the other person will accept us for who we are, flaws and all.
Precisely. It's about creating a space where we feel safe enough to be ourselves without fear of judgment or rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of safety can only be created through honest communication, even when it involves difficult conversations.
And this applies not just to romantic relationships, but to all of our relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
Friendships, family relationships, even our relationships with colleagues and acquaintances.
Absolutely. Trust is essential for any kind of healthy relationship.
So how do we go about building this trust? It seems like something that takes time and effort.
It does. And there's no quick fix or magic formula, but there are certain things we can do to cultivate trust in our relationships.
It's like, what? Give me some practical tips here.
Well, one important element is consistency. Our words and actions need to align.
So if we say we're going to do something, we need to follow through.
Exactly. And it's not just about big promises or commitments.
Right.
It's also about the little things.
Mm-hmm.
Being on time, keeping our word, following through on our agreements.
Okay.
These seemingly small actions build trust over time.
It's like those small deposits in a bank account.
Yeah.
They might not seem like much individually,
Yes.
but they add up over time.
Exactly. And another key ingredient is vulnerability.
Okay, I get how honesty is important, but vulnerability seems even scarier.
It can be, but it's also incredibly powerful. Vulnerability is about letting down our guard and allowing ourselves to be seen imperfections and all.
It's about being willing to share our fears, our doubts, our struggles with the people we trust.
And when we do that, it creates space for deeper connection.
Yeah.
It shows the other person that we trust them enough to let them see our true selves.
And that level of trust can be incredibly bonding. It creates a sense of intimacy and shared experience that can be hard to find.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that vulnerability doesn't mean oversharing or burdening others with our problems.
Right.
It's about being selective about who we share with and making sure that the other person is capable of holding that space for us.
So it's about being discerning about who we trust and making sure they're worthy of that trust.
Right. And it's also about recognizing that trust is a two-way street. If we want others to trust us, we need to be trustworthy ourselves.
So it all comes back to that idea of integrity, of aligning our words and actions.
Exactly. And it's also about being reliable, being someone that others can count on.
This is starting to feel less like a checklist and more like a way of being.
It is. Building trust is an ongoing process.
Right.
It requires effort, intentionality, and a willingness to be vulnerable, but the rewards are immeasurable.
So it's worth the risk, even if it means getting hurt sometimes.
It is, because without trust, there can be no real intimacy, no true connection.
Right.
And those are the things that make life worth living.
This has been a really insightful conversation. I feel like I'm starting to understand the nuances of this not giving a fuck philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about being indifferent or apathetic.
Right.
It's about being intentional with our time and energy, about choosing our battles wisely, and about building authentic connections based on trust and vulnerability.
I think you've nailed it. It's about living a life that is aligned with our values, even if that means going against the grain or challenging conventional wisdom.
And it's about embracing the uncertainty of life, recognizing that we don't always have the answers, and that's okay.
Exactly. It's about trusting ourselves in the journey, even when it's messy and unpredictable.
Okay, I'm ready for more. What else does Manson have to say about living a more fulfilling life?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already, but there's one more big topic to tackle.
Okay, death.
Death. Seriously, I thought we were done with that morbid stuff.
I know it might seem like a strange topic for a self-help book, but trust me, Manson has a unique perspective on this.
He actually uses the concept of death as a way to highlight the importance of living a meaningful life.
Okay, now I'm really curious. How does he connect those two things?
He starts by sharing the story of his friend Josh, who died in a cliff diving accident when they were teenagers.
I remember you mentioning that earlier. It sounds like a really profound and painful experience.
It was, and it had a huge impact on Manson's worldview.
Mm-hmm.
It forced him to confront his own mortality at a young age, and it made him question what truly mattered in life.
I can imagine. It's amazing how such a tragic event can be a catalyst for growth and self-discovery.
It's like that saying, sometimes you have to hit rock bottom to discover the foundation you're built on. In Manson's case, Josh's death shook him out of his complacency and helped him see what was truly important.
So it wasn't just about dealing with the grief.
Right.
It was about using that experience to redefine his priorities and live a more intentional life.
Exactly, and that's where Manson brings in the work of Ernest Becker, who wrote extensively about death anxiety and its impact on human behavior.
Death anxiety. I've never really thought about that before.
It's this underlying fear of our own mortality that influences many of our choices and actions.
Okay.
Often subconsciously, Becker argued that we create these elaborate immortality projects as a way to cope with this fear.
Immortality projects. What are those?
They're basically anything we do to try to leave a lasting mark on the world
Okay.
or create a sense of meaning and purpose that extends beyond our own lifespan.
So things like building a successful career, having children writing a book, creating art, making a scientific discovery.
Exactly. Those are all examples of immortality projects.
Okay.
And they're not inherently bad. In fact, they can be incredibly motivating and inspiring.
But they can also become problematic if we become too attached to them.
Right. The problem arises when we start to believe that our worth and value are solely tied to our achievements or our legacy.
It's like we're putting all our eggs in one basket, hoping that our immortality project will somehow validate our existence.
And that can lead to a lot of anxiety and pressure because what happens if our immortality project fails?
Yeah. What happens if we don't achieve the level of success or recognition we were hoping for?
It can be devastating. It's like our whole sense of self-worth comes crashing down.
And that's why Manson suggests that we need to find a sense of meaning and purpose that transcends our immortality projects.
So it's not about abandoning our goals or aspirations. It's about finding a deeper sense of purpose that doesn't depend on external validation.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our worth and value are inherent, regardless of what we achieve or how others perceive us.
And that's where the acceptance of death comes in, right?
Yes.
By acknowledging our own mortality, we're able to let go of the need for external validation and find peace in the present moment.
Precisely. It's about recognizing that our time is limited and that every moment is precious.
So it's not about becoming morbid or obsessed with death. It's about using that awareness to fuel a more meaningful and fulfilling life.
Exactly. It's about appreciating the beauty and fragility of life and making the most of the time we have. This is a lot to process. I'm starting to see how all these ideas connect. Choosing our struggles, taking action, building trust, embracing uncertainty, and even accepting death.
It does.
It all ties into this idea of living a more intentional and authentic life.
And that's really the essence of the subtle art of not giving a fuck.
Right.
It's not about being indifferent or apathetic. It's about choosing what truly matters to us and letting go of the rest.
It's about defining our own values, setting our own priorities, and living a life that is true to ourselves, even if it means going against the grain or challenging conventional wisdom.
And it's about recognizing that we have the power to create a life that is both meaningful and fulfilling, even in the face of uncertainty and adversity.
Okay, I'm ready to keep exploring. What else does Manson have to say about this journey of self-discovery?
Well, we've laid a solid foundation, but there's still more to uncover. We'll be delving into the practical applications of this philosophy, looking at how it can help us navigate our relationships, our work, and even our own personal growth.
I'm excited to hear more. But for now, let's take a break and give our listeners a chance to digest all this information. Join us for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll wrap up our exploration of the subtle art of not giving a fuck. See you soon. Welcome back to our deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a fuck.
We've we've talked about a lot, from choosing our struggles to embracing uncertainty.
Right.
But, now we're facing the ultimate reality check, death.
Yeah, it's the one thing we all have in common, yet we often go to great lengths to avoid thinking about it.
It's like this big elephant in the room that nobody wants to acknowledge. But Manson argues that confronting our mortality is actually crucial for living a more meaningful life.
He's not suggesting we become morbid or obsessed with death,
Right.
but rather that we use this awareness as a guiding principle.
Okay, that makes sense.
That
If you're constantly reminded of your limited time, you're probably more likely to make each day count.
Precisely. And to illustrate this point, Manson shares the story of his friend Josh, who died unexpectedly in a cliff diving accident. I remember you mentioning this earlier. It sounds like a really profound experience for Manson.
It was Josh's death forced him to confront his own mortality at a young age, and it had a profound impact on his worldview.
It's amazing how such a painful experience can be a catalyst for growth and self-discovery.
It's like that saying, sometimes you have to hit rock bottom to discover the foundation you're built on.
Right.
In Manson's case, Josh's death shook him out of his complacency and helped him see what truly mattered.
So it wasn't just about dealing with the grief. It was
Yeah.
about using that experience to redefine his priorities and live a more intentional life.
Exactly. And that's where Manson introduces the work of Ernest Becker,
Hmm.
who wrote extensively about death anxiety and its impact on human behavior.
Death anxiety. That sounds pretty heavy. Is that something we all experience?
To some degree, yes. It's this underlying fear of our own mortality that influences many of our choices and actions, often subconsciously.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this connects to the not giving a fuck philosophy.
Hmm.
If we're constantly worried about death, we're likely to waste a lot of energy on things that don't really matter.
Exactly. And Becker argued that we create these elaborate immortality projects as a way to cope with this death anxiety.
Immortality projects. What are those?
They're essentially anything we do to try to leave a lasting mark on the world or create a sense of meaning and purpose that extends beyond our own lifespan.
So things like building a successful career, having children, writing a book, creating art, making a scientific discovery.
Precisely. These are all examples of things people do to feel like they're making a difference, that their lives have significance.
And there's nothing wrong with wanting to leave a legacy, right?
Of course not. These projects can be incredibly motivating and inspiring.
Yeah.
The problem arises when we become too attached to them, when we start to believe that our worth and value are solely tied to our achievements or our legacy.
It's like we're putting all our eggs in one basket,
Hmm.
hoping that our immortality project will somehow validate our existence.
Exactly, and that can lead to a lot of anxiety and pressure, because what happens if our immortality project fails? What happens if we don't achieve the level of success or recognition we are hoping for?
It can be a real blow to our ego, for sure. And it can make us question our entire purpose in life.
Right, and that's why Manson suggests that we need to find a sense of meaning and purpose that transcends our immortality projects.
So it's not about abandoning our goals or aspirations. It's about finding a deeper sense of purpose that doesn't depend on external validation.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our worth and value are inherent regardless of what we achieve or how others perceive us.
This reminds me of something we talked about earlier,
Uh-huh.
the importance of defining our own values and metrics for success.
Absolutely, it's all connected. If we're relying on external validation to define our worth, we're setting ourselves up for disappointment, because there will always be someone more successful, more talented, more whatever.
So how do we shift our perspective?
Mhm.
How do we find that deeper sense of purpose that doesn't depend on external validation?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. But Manson suggests that one way to start is by acknowledging and accepting our own mortality.
Okay, but how does that help? Isn't thinking about death just going to make us more anxious?
It might seem counterintuitive, but Manson argues that by confronting our fear of death, we can actually free ourselves from it.
It's like facing your fears head on rather than trying to avoid them.
Exactly. And by acknowledging the fact that our time is limited, we're more likely to make choices that align with our values and bring us true fulfillment.
So it's about living intentionally, recognizing that each day is a gift.
Precisely. And this doesn't mean we have to quit our jobs, abandon our families, or become hermits in the mountains. It's about finding ways to infuse our everyday lives with meaning and purpose.
It's about appreciating the little things, savoring the moments, connecting with the people we love.
Exactly. And it's about being present in our own lives rather than constantly worrying about the past or the future.
This is starting to sound less like a self-help book and more like a philosophy for living. It's about recognizing that life is a journey, not a destination.
And it's a journey that's full of twists and turns, ups and downs. There will be times when we feel lost, confused, and uncertain. But that's all part of the experience.
It's about embracing the messiness of life, the good and the bad, the joy and the sorrow.
And it's about finding a way to make peace with our own mortality, recognizing that death is a natural part of life.
This has been an incredibly thought-provoking conversation. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on what it means to not give a fuck.
Me too. It's not about being indifferent or apathetic. It's about choosing our battles, wisely defining our own values, and focusing our energy on the things that truly matter.
It's about living a life that is authentic, meaningful, and fulfilling, even in the face of uncertainty and adversity.
And it all starts with that simple but profound question. What are you willing to struggle for?
That's a question we can all ask ourselves, regardless of where we are in life.
It's a question that can help us clarify our priorities, set our intentions, and live a life that is true to ourselves.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a fuck. We hope you found some valuable insights that you can apply to your own life.
Remember, it's not about being perfect or having all the answers. It's about embracing the journey, learning from our experiences, and making the most of the time we have.
And above all, it's about remembering that we have the power to choose what we give a fuck about. And that's a powerful thing.
So until next time, keep choosing your struggles wisely and live a life that is true to you.
And don't forget to enjoy the ride.